For over 150 years, the Oak Island legend has attracted treasure hunters, researchers, and writers. What could be more appealing than a story of hidden gold, ingenious traps, pirates, and the potential for vast wealth? Generations of writers have led readers to believe a tale involving a complex, underground system of flood tunnels cunningly constructed by unknown protagonists that repeatedly defeated the best engineering minds of the day. Generation after generation, searchers dug further into the earth in an effort to find the treasures they believed lay below. Sadly, the tale they've told is largely the result of folklore, poor research, and possibly even fraud. Each generation of writers build on the errors of those who came before, altering and in some cases even creating new claims that sold more books and attracted more attention. Documentary evidence drawn from these very books shows how writers have twisted the tale over the years until the version shown in many books has little resemblance to any actual events. Let's talk about how the tale developed and about some of the more well-known elements in the legend. First, we'll look at the legend itself and how it's usually told in modern accounts. From here, we'll work backwards toward the genesis of the tale so we can see how it's been altered over the years, and along the way we'll meet a cast of characters that include a famous polar explorer, a 20th century U.S. president, dowsers, practitioners of divination, and outright frauds who preyed on unwitting citizens in their beliefs in the existence of vast treasure hoards all over eastern North America. Here we see a fairly typical depiction of the Money Pit location with several of the primary elements in place. Since the island's geology plays directly into the legend, let's review how it was initially formed. Oak Island itself is a tiny freckle of land lying at its highest, only 30 to 35 feet above the local sea level. Geologically, it's what is known as a glacial drumlin, a relic of past glaciers that deposited large volumes of sand and boulders as they retreated north several ice ages ago. On top of the sand and boulder layer lies a denser clay soil deposited by a later geologic event. Underlying both these is a bedrock layer primarily composed of a type of limestone known as anhydrite. According to the legend, in 1795, 3 men, who are sometimes referred to as boys on an adventure, rode to the island. There they found a large oak tree with cut-off limbs and, according to most modern versions of the story, an ancient ship's pulley or tackle block, hanging from one branch. Below this branch lay a depression indicating someone had once dug beneath the pulley. Some versions of the tale say that new undergrowth was springing up around the area, which showed evidence of once having been cleared. The boys began digging in the depression and are said to have found 3 layers of worked oak beams at 10, 20, and 30 feet. In some versions, a layer of stones was found a few feet below the surface. Once they hit the 30-foot mark, the 3 are said to have abandoned efforts to dig up whatever was below, went home, and did not visit the island again until a treasure hunting syndicate, or corporation, was organized in 1803 by several wealthy men in the Chester, Nova Scotia area. This group is said to have dug to the 100-foot level, encountering layers of oak beams every 10 feet, along with items such as coconut fiber, putty or cement, and charcoal. Most versions of the story say the diggers uncovered an inscribed stone at the 90-foot level, but were unable to read any of the characters scratched into it. At 95 feet and with daylight failing, the men are said to have encountered another oak layer a few feet below by driving iron rods into the soil. They abandoned efforts for the night, returning the next morning only to find the pit half filled with water. As they were unable to bail this water out by hand, they abandoned all efforts and went home. It is said that another excavation attempt was made in 1849, and the first documented event occurred in the 1860s. On both occasions, diggers excavated additional pits alongside the original in an effort to undercut the water problem. All these efforts are said to have failed, with water rushing into the newly dug pits and miners barely escaping with their lives. It was at this time, again according to the legend, that it was discovered the water was not fresh but seawater. Treasure companies are said to have discovered that this was being fed to the pit via a pair of cleverly dug flood tunnels running from Smith's Cove on the eastern shore of the island. These were, it was claimed, fed by an artificial beach lined with coconut fiber and rocks that created a huge siphon to draw water to the money pit. Here we see a rough list of the treasure syndicates and dates prior to 1960. It starts with the original 1795 claim by 3 men, McGinnis, Smith, and Vaughn. As you can see, each successive company was able to excavate further due to the availability of newer technology. Steam-powered pumps and drills were used starting with the 1860-era efforts, culminating in Robert Restall's massive excavation in the 1950s and early 60s using huge shovels and other heavy equipment. At that time, the original money pit was completely lost after the area around it was excavated to at least 100 feet in diameter. No one knows exactly where it was. All the trees are long gone, and any evidence such as oak beams and other materials have vanished. The alleged inscribed stone is variously said to have been used as a fireback in Smith's fireplace for a time, then given to a Halifax bookbinder who used it as a hammering table until the inscription was completely obliterated. Allegedly, it was last seen as a stepstone in a shop in Halifax in 1912, but this is merely part of the accumulated folklore. Of particular note is the 1860-era work, since it was then that the first written articles on the island were produced by local newspapers. One is said to have been written by the digger Patrick and bears the same title. Another was called The Oak Island Folly and was critical of the enterprise. Absolutely no written material confirming any of the pre-1860 work has ever been found. This is critical since it means that all claims of oak beams, inscribed stones, and the discovery of the pit were based solely on reminiscences and tall tales told by some of the men involved in these early efforts. Major excavations of the money pit site tailed off in later years, with the last significant efforts being those by Robert Dunfeld and then a group known as the Triton Alliance, which was largely controlled by Dan Blankenship and David Tobias. The latter group dug a feature dubbed Borehole 10X, which was a caisson arrangement with steel sleeves driven to a depth of, yes really, 200 feet, and kept dry by a series of pumps to remove the water. At one point, the Canadian Broadcasting Company lowered a camera into the murky water at the bottom to record video footage. Proponents of the legend claim that a skeletal hand and the corner of a treasure chest were seen in the depths before the camera was withdrawn. Interpretation of this very poor and grainy video is extremely subjective. Since that time, the only known major work was a short survey performed at the request of David Mugar, a wealthy Boston industrialist who was once interested in the possibility of investing in the money pit. He paid for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute of Massachusetts to conduct a 2-week survey into the site and the island. The results are unavailable for study, but interviews with 2 of the scientists in the 1990s suggested they found nothing sufficiently interesting to entice Mr. Mugar to invest in the effort. Most recently, investors known as the Michigan Group have taken over ownership of the land and are allegedly conducting additional studies to determine what should be done next. In its 150 years of documented exploration, the money pit has not disgorged even a penny. We'll talk about some of the items that have been found or claimed to have been discovered in and around the site. These photos show several existing features on the island. In the upper left-hand corner is the only visible indication of earlier excavations. It's known as the Hedden Shaft, after Gil Hedden, who performed work on the pit in the early 20th century. This entire area is undercut with old shafts and cross tunnels cut by various treasure hunting companies during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Not all are documented, but they may literally number nearly 100 in total. On the top right is the building where Triton Alliance's Borehole 10X is located. This was constructed in the 1960s, and the building still stands today. The lower right-hand photo is a view into the top of Borehole 10X itself. The steel lining of this caisson arrangement began buckling while Dan Blankenship of Triton Alliance was near the bottom. He'd barely escaped with his life. The lower left shows current activity on the island in 2009. Each pipe is the top of a test boring conducted by treasure explorers in hopes of discovering the best location to dig a new shaft. They've actually dug so deep that they're penetrating through the limestone bedrock layer and are bringing up even lower deposits of rock that appears to be basalt. It has been claimed that a number of pieces of physical evidence have been brought back from the depths of the money pit or from other locations on the island itself. Probably the most famous example is the Inscribed Stone, said to have been found at the 90-foot level, probably in 1803 or 04. We'll discuss this in more detail later on. During the 1860-era excavation, it was claimed that several links from a gold chain were brought up by an auger, or a large drill, that was being used in an attempt to test for the presence of treasure chests at the bottom of the pit. If these ever existed, they have long since vanished. They also have an interesting history, since the earliest accounts said links from a gold chain as if forced from an epaulet. An epaulet is part of a military uniform, usually worn on the shoulder, and was intended to show the wearer's rank. The epaulet component was long ago dropped from any account of the event, and no longer appears in books about the island. At the same time, treasure hunters claimed that oak chips that might have come from a treasure chest were brought up by the auger. However, this claim fails to take into account the fact that the wooden supports used to keep the sides of the money pit excavations from collapsing had themselves collapsed on many occasions prior to this event. The wood, if it was actually brought up by the drill, could easily have been from one of these supports as well. These chips are also missing if they ever existed. Another important artifact is a tiny piece of parchment, also said to have been brought up in or around 1861 by the same drill. It is claimed to have had the letters VI written on it. Recent accounts claim that the owners of Triton Alliance had this piece of parchment, but no other information about it is available. Some accounts also claim that a form of cement, sometimes referred to as blue clay, was found during the early excavations. No further information is available about this claim. Fibers, said to have been from coconut husks, are said to have been pulled both from the pit and from the beach at Smith's Cove. The former is totally unverified and can never be verified, but the latter was partially confirmed by the Woods Hole group. More on this later. On numerous occasions, old tools and other items have been pulled from the pit. We have photos of some of these items, but no way to determine if they were artifacts from earlier treasure recovery excavations or from the alleged original burial of treasure on the island. In the 1800s, someone found what became known as a stone triangle lying midway between the Money Pit site and South Cove. It is said this triangle pointed directly toward the Money Pit. Sadly, it was never researched to discover whether it had lain there since the alleged original burial, and this feature, which could have been evaluated using archaeological techniques to determine its age, was destroyed during the early 20th century while a treasure hunting expedition was in progress. An apparent slipway, or wooden ramp for launching small boats, was found at South Cove in the 20th century. This feature still exists in some form and is a legitimate, interesting physical feature deserving of actual study. Its origins and age are totally unknown. The series of flood tunnels and fan drains said to run from the Money Pit to South Cove are perhaps the most enigmatic elements. The tunnels themselves have never been verified but are presumed to exist by treasure hunters. No one has ever seen these tunnels, only the claimed effect of water being brought to the Money Pit. In the 1960s, Robert Dunfield said he actually had himself lowered in an excavator bucket into the hugely expanded Money Pit in an effort to locate the outlet of these tunnels. He was unable to see any evidence they actually existed. Dunfield also wrote that he had excavated at the shore of Smith's Cove to find the bottom of the reported fan drain. He wrote that there was a vertical shaft filled with gravel running 90 feet straight down, but it did not turn toward the pit. Instead, it ended. This leaves us with an interesting question. What was it for and who built it? It may or may not have any relationship at all with the Money Pit. Many books and websites have published diagrams showing their version of the profile of the Money Pit. These layouts are all derived from the typical accounts of the original excavations as published in the 1861 newspaper articles. However, none of these are based on reality since the existence of all these features is totally unverified. The alleged flood tunnels have, as we have already seen, never been discovered or viewed, despite numerous attempts to locate them. In one article from 1861, the digger Patrick, who claimed to have been part of the excavation, said that they had dug vertical shafts on all four sides of the Money Pit, very close to the original location, but had never encountered water until they attempted to tunnel sideways under the old pit. Had the flood tunnels existed, these diggers would have encountered at least one of the tunnels while digging their vertical shafts. Yet, Patrick claimed all four of these new tunnels were totally dry until the side shafts were run beneath the original pit. Likewise, the presence of treasure chests near 100 feet was never confirmed by any of the treasure companies. This claim is based on the use of the auger in 1861 and the recovery of oak chips these men assumed were from treasure chests. If the chests existed, where did they go? In 1861, men assumed they had fallen into a void in the rock during flooding. Yet, despite having pushed downward to 200 feet, no such chests have ever been found. One claim frequently made by treasure hunters is that the flooding cannot be natural in origin due to the hard clay soil that is impervious to water infiltration. This assertion is correct, but only near the surface. As noted earlier, the island is a glacial till with a layer of what was called sand and boulder rocks by a visitor to the island in the 1860s. This layer starts at around the 110-foot level, which is an easy explanation for the presence of seawater. With the island only 35 feet above sea level and the pit over 100 feet deep, the presence of seawater should be no surprise. Modern accounts also claim that the original pit was totally dry until the night workers reached the 95-foot level. This totally ignores even the original accounts of the excavation written with the help of survivors of that excavation in 1861. These men said that, by the time they hit the 90-foot level, they were bringing up 2 buckets of water for every 1 of earth. It's pretty obvious this detail was omitted by later writers in order to bolster the idea that the flooding was man-made. So why did the pit flood? The answer likely lies in the geology of the island. As we earlier noted, the bedrock is anhydrite limestone. This type of rock is very sensitive to water, and indeed, the bedrock beneath the area is filled with natural caverns carved by flowing water. Once early excavations started pumping water out of the pit, the anhydrite in the area was broken down by the water flow. The effect only got worse as more water was pumped from the area, enlarging the voids into the natural caverns. Here we see a number of physical items said to have been discovered on the island at various times. The object at upper left is generally referred to as the heart-shaped stone for obvious reasons, though information about the context in which it was found is sketchy at best. Next to it is an item generally referred to as the Spanish scissors. According to writer Darcy O'Connor, these were found in 1967 at the site of the artificial beach at Smith's Cove. It is claimed they were identified as a Spanish-American manufacture by the Smithsonian, though we have no confirmation of this, and the design is a very common one. Both photos to the right are of the very interesting slipway at South Cove. This feature was unearthed in the mid-20th century and has not been identified positively. Were the site examined by archaeologists, they could probably make a determination as to when it was constructed and whether it has any bearing on the original tale. Some have suggested the use of Roman numerals to mark the logs used in this construction reflects military intent, but this is only supposition. It's just as likely the type of marking system was used because it was easier to carve into the wooden logs than traditional numbers. At bottom right is a measuring stick or ruler unearthed from one of the pits. The matchbook was put in the image in order to provide some scale. One of the major problems with all the artifacts found at the island is that none were discovered or excavated using archaeological techniques. Thus, we have no idea when any of the items were deposited at the site and no way to determine how or if they're related to the alleged event prior to 1795, when treasure was allegedly deposited on the island. The money pit has been mentioned in many books and articles over the years. Until 1958, citations in books were confined to short chapters in compendia of treasure tales and stories. The first of these books appeared around the turn of the 20th century, with many such books mentioning the money pit. In 1958, Canadian writer R.V. Harris published what appears to have been the first book solely dedicated to the money pit. This launched what became a cottage industry of writers dedicating books to the topic. Several of these are mentioned here, but nearly all cite the basic legend as presented by Harris. Magazine articles include Popular Science, Wired Magazine, Collier's, and many others over the years. The URL at the bottom of this page provides a reasonably complete set of available works in all formats. Editions should be sent to the site admins if discovered. The money pit story has also been used in several works of fiction. Treasure tales were very common in the latter 19th century, and scholar James DeMille wrote 2 such books that used elements of the Oak Island money pit story. The first, called The Treasure of the Seas, presented the tale very close to that of the Money Pit, and used the motif of three boys on an adventure as the main characters. This is also very possibly the source of the commonly held belief that the Money Pit tale originated with three boys on an adventure, rowing to the island to see what secrets it might hold. The same James DeMille is commonly thought to be the old Irish schoolmaster who pronounced the commonly used 40 feet down 2 million pounds are buried translation of the alleged Inscribed Stone. This belief is commonly handed down in books and magazine articles, but is totally incorrect, as we'll see later on in this presentation. The reality is far more interesting than the story. Many people have made guesses, some far more educated than others, over the years as to who might have created the Money Pit. The first books and articles all generally used Captain Kidd as the protagonist. This idea fell out of favor once it became known that Kidd never amassed a major treasure and was never in the vicinity of the island during his career. At that point, the pit became generally associated with pirates without naming names. This idea is not without merit, since pirates were well known to frequent the area. Many tales of wreckers, or pirates who used deceptions such as lanterns to lure unwary ships onto the rocks in order to plunder their cargo, are told in Nova Scotia. In fact, the use of coconut fiber as ship's dunnage, which was the ancient equivalent to packing peanuts in bubble wrap, might explain why so much coconut fiber has allegedly been found at Smith's Cove. However, no records of actual activity on the island have come to light. Several authors have suggested that British or French military forces might have set up a small base on the island or used it to store supplies. Despite many hours in the National Maritime Museum and other locations in London, this author has found no evidence suggesting this was ever the case. In more recent years, the Money Pit legend has been frequently hijacked by proponents of the Templar legend as a potential resting place for the allegedly vast fortune said to have been spirited away by that order centuries ago. Discussions like this belong more in the pages of potboiler mysteries than in legitimate discussions of the possible history of the Money Pit, since much of the Templar legend itself rests on very shaky ground and even more is entirely fictional. One other book, by Penn Leary, suggested that Shakespeare's manuscripts were hidden on the island. If this is true, it's fairly obvious all the digging and drilling performed in the 19th century would have penetrated the hopefully watertight chests used to store these priceless objects, which means that at this point they're a total loss. In a total flight of what I can hope is fancy, a New Age author once suggested the Money Pit was being used to hold an alien remolecularizer, I kid you not, that was placed there by shape-shifting creatures for use in controlling the minds of unwitting humans. No, I'm really not kidding about this. From the skeptical viewpoint, many of the elements of the story are highly suspect and deserving of far more scrutiny than they've received. In many cases, credulous writers have presented the party line story, as it's been told since roughly 1861, without actually analyzing or questioning it in any way. Critical thinking about Oak Island isn't new and seems to have originated with the 1861 article The Oak Island Folly, which questioned the whole story and also the motives of the treasure hunting company involved. This article mentions that, when the diggers seemed close to finding the treasure, shares in the stock company sold for enormous prices. This has all the hallmarks of a treasure hunting scam, as we'll see shortly. One extremely interesting piece of evidence was only uncovered again a few years ago by a Nova Scotian researcher named Paul Rychlowski. In 1867, the John Brown Engineering Company was hired to perform test borings into the flooded pit to help diggers of that era decide where to dig next. His report, which is extensive and very well written, debunks many common assertions about the Money Pit tale. For example, the common legend says that at one point the auger was making a noise like money in pieces, or coins were being drilled through. Supporters of the tale took this to mean they had struck a treasure chest filled with coins. John Brown's report said this was nonsense for two reasons. First, he'd commonly heard the same noise when drilling through loose rock or gravel, which was a common feature at the depth of the drill at the time. Second, he said specifically that, had they been drilling through a box of coins, many of these would have come up on the drill. He said it was his common practice to flip a coin into the hole being drilled with total confidence the drill would bring it back up again, in every case. It's hardly surprising that, as soon as this report was delivered to the company that financed it, all treasure recovery operations ceased for nearly 30 years. It's also not surprising that this report was rapidly lost and never cited by any of the many treasure groups that later decided to dig on the island. The skeptical view continued in 1911, with former investor Henry Bowden publicly denouncing the money pit as a hoax. In the 1990s, I began accumulating resources for a bibliography and decided on a source review to locate any earlier versions of the tale that might use primary sources such as letters, news articles, or other materials. I was extremely interested in finding out how far back the story could be traced from the point of view of documentary evidence. A serious source review using materials from the National Maritime Museum, British Public Library, and Nova Scotia Archives and Records Management began in 1999. This resulted in a number of very critical discoveries. First, the paper trail effectively stopped at 1861 with the original news articles on that era's treasure hunters. The 1795 and 1803 events are solely based on the reminiscences of two surviving treasure hunters from that era. This is not to say they were lying, but that memory is imperfect, very fallible, and that it is very easy for a tale such as this to grow into a very tall one over many retellings. The only earlier written material is a tiny article from 1849, which is a request for permission from the current landowner to dig at the money pit site. No additional information on this era is available. It was also found that R.V. Harris had access to material that directly contradicts several of the common elements of the story, but chose not to publish this material for his own reasons. Given that his book was used by all subsequent writers, his errors were magnified and amplified until they became accepted as fact. Researching the money pit legend requires a multidisciplinary approach, since several areas of study are appropriate to solving this problem. Archaeology has never actually occurred in any form on the island, with all excavation having been performed by treasure hunters with no training or knowledge of procedures that would have preserved materials for further study. This same cavalier approach to artifact removal also means we have no idea when most of the alleged artifacts were deposited on the island. This ongoing destruction of the site since at least 1860 means we will in all likelihood never know when or how some of the features on the island were created or what they mean. Folklore is a critical component to understanding the tale, especially once it's understood that the whole eastern portion of North America was rife with legends of buried gold. We'll talk about these in more detail later in this video. Understanding the geology of the island means having an appreciation of how the glacial origins and bedrock composition affect the story. Once we understand that the bedrock is anhydrite, a material very vulnerable to water infiltration once it's disturbed, a far more natural explanation of the allegedly human-created flooding becomes apparent. This same appreciation for geology, and an understanding that the area on and around the island commonly experiences major sinkholes due to ongoing decay of limestone bedrock, makes the money pit itself seem far less mysterious. Finally, understanding the history of the area and population is critical to a real appreciation for the story. Knowing the difference between primary sources, such as letters or other documents from the period, and secondary ones, such as the account of the money pit published in 1861, helps us understand how unreliable certain pieces of the story really are. When approaching this topic, one must start with no initial assumptions and simply allow study to be driven by the evidence. Belief must take a back seat to proof. As an example of how researching documentary evidence helps us separate fact from fiction, let's look at the reality behind the inscribed stone. The symbols on this slide show the inscription as it's generally shown in all books and websites. This is a critical element of the legend since its alleged discovery at 90 feet in 1803 is the centerpiece of the story. But let's just ask some basic questions. First, no sketch or rubbing of the symbols was ever shown in any written account of the money pit. Even a prospectus published in 1893 by one of the treasure hunting companies contains no photographs or other images of this stone. So the question is, where did these symbols originate? If we trace the tale forward from the 1861 articles, none of the sources show any such symbols until the year 1953. It was that year that Edward Rowe Snow, writer of popular history and tall tales from New England, published his book True Tales of Buried Treasure. In it, he depicts these symbols and mentions that he obtained them from one Reverend A.T. Kempton of Cambridge, Massachusetts. But where did Kempton obtain them? The answer to all these questions can be found in R.V. Harris's papers, as well as material contained in the papers of Admiral Richard Byrd, polar explorer. Byrd was once interested in the Money Pit legend, but was warned off it by several friends who thought it was a hoax. He was in contact with several Money Pit explorers and exchanged significant correspondence with several in the 1930s. As it turns out, our Reverend Kempton was an Oak Island addict as well, who was in touch with Byrd as well as the current owners of the Money Pit. Kempton, in one of his letters, revealed that he had once written to persons in Nova Scotia in the 1890s requesting that someone write him a story of the Oak Island legend. Part of the tale he received, which he was told was written by an old Irish schoolmaster, whose name he did not know, was these symbols. He never knew where they came from and never investigated any of the claims in the tale. In fact, the treasure hunters he was in touch with considered Kempton a crank and disagreed with much of the story he had been given. However, Kempton gave a copy to Snow. Snow used it and published the symbols in his book. The rest, as they say, is history. Every writer since 1953 has published the same symbols without having any idea about their origin. Most Money Pit readers today seem to consider these symbols an actual representation of markings copied directly from the stone. In fact, they were a total fabrication made by an unknown person who wrote a tall tale for A.T. Kempton sometime in the 1890s. Another use of documentary evidence involves observing how the story has evolved over time. The period of roughly 1890 through the 1920s appears to have been the heyday of books containing lists of allegedly lost treasures and the stories behind them. The Oak Island legend appears in many, with details changing over time. In several cases, these books contain claims that so-called unusual species of plants were found growing near the Money Pit. In one instance, an author claimed that live oak, a species of oak found only in the U.S. southeastern states, had been found growing on Oak Island. It is now thought that he had heard a claim, cited often in the tale during that era, that there were only a few live oaks, or living oak trees, remaining on the island, and somehow misinterpreted the term live oak to mean the species rather than the condition. Nevertheless, this claim was repeated several times before vanishing altogether as false. During the same period, it was common for stories about the island to make the claim that there were only 6 living oaks on the island and that the treasure would not be found until the last one was dead. Several of these works also claimed that red clover, which is claimed not to be native to the Nova Scotia region, was found growing near the Money Pit. This, it was said, was proof that some human agency was responsible for the Money Pit. The reality is that red clover is extremely common in Nova Scotia, so it is unknown why this claim was made in the first place. The diameter of the pit is another element that changes over time. Some authors use 8 feet, others 12, 15, or even larger. No rhyme or reason to these changes is apparent, but this is another example of how the tale is altered over time. A more important alteration is in the description of both the oak beams and the tackle block. In the earliest written versions of the pit legend, the platforms said to have been found every 10 feet are described as rotted logs. In the mid-20th century, at least one writer changed this to worked oak beams. This change has persisted over time. Likewise, the men who discovered the pit in 1795 are said to have found not a tackle block, but a tree nail or piece of oak cut and pinned between 2 branches. The change from tree nail to pulley or tackle block seems to have occurred early in the 20th century, when fewer readers would know what a tree nail was. In all these cases, we can see the tale being altered in order to make the claim of human involvement stronger and more appealing. Now it's time to discuss the influence of folklore on the Money Pit tale. This is an important aspect of study since it will show us how much influence the idea of buried treasure had on early American and Canadian society at this time. It's a little-known historical fact that the early colonies were filled with stories of pirate and other treasures. It was thought that many native tribes operated hidden gold mines. Stories of Europeans being blindfolded and taken to one of these mines, deep in the wilderness, were very common in New England and New York throughout this era. Some of these stories persisted until the early 20th century, if not later. One of the features of this area was the appearance of men who called themselves money diggers, and who claimed the ability to find buried treasure using mystical means such as divination or common dowsing. It was common for these men to appear in an area, claim their abilities to the locals, then cause themselves to be hired as consultants to take locals into the woods to dig for treasure. These events, which were always held at night, usually involved the money digger using his claimed ability to locate a spot where treasure was buried. He would then invoke a deity, or give a prayer, or create a so-called magic circle around the spot, which he would claim was guarded by spirits of dead pirates or Indians. The men were told not to speak at all until the treasure was uncovered, because if they did, the spirits would hear them and literally snatch the treasure away. Of course, one man would always fail to follow the instructions to the letter, resulting in the gold being literally spirited away before it could be recovered. The image on this slide shows this motif, with men in the woods being frightened out of a hole they've dug by the sudden appearance of demonic apparitions to snatch away the treasure. One is reminded very much of a modern snipe hunt. Let's now take a look at several examples of folklore from the era. These are obvious examples of cases that closely resemble claims made about Oak Island. He set to work with alacrity and a shovel, and soon he unearthed a flat stone and an iron bar. We can compare the flat stone with the inscribed stone claimed to have been found at Oak Island. The iron bar is easily equated with the iron rod said to have been used by the first diggers to probe the bottom of the pit for treasure chests. An old saying has been handed down among the people of the island, from whom it came they have forgotten, that was to this effect: dig 6 feet and you will find iron, dig 6 more and you will find money. We can see the obvious comparison between this saying and the 40 feet down 2 million pounds are buried claim made about the money pit. Then rumors were circulated that a long auger had been made and it had bored through the deck of the sunken ship. When the auger was brought to the surface, pieces of silver were caught in the thread. This claim is almost exactly identical to the claim of links of a gold chain being brought up in the auger at Oak Island. Even more interesting is that this claim came from a story told along the Hudson River involving a ship said to have belonged to Captain Kidd and sailed by his crew back to America after his death. The comparisons are obvious. Many of the elements of the Oak Island tale are simply common folkloric motifs used in many different tales. The difference is that these other tales are little known to most people, which makes the Money Pit story seem that much more interesting. Here we see a few items common to claims of divination. The item on the left is known as a seer stone or peepstone. This particular instance was owned by Joseph Smith Jr., founder of Mormonism, whose father and other relatives were known as money diggers in upstate New York during the period in question. To use the stone, Smith would take it from his pocket, remove his hat, turn the hat upside down, then put the stone inside the hat. He would then put his face over the hat to block out light and use the stone to see objects buried in the area. To the right, we see an early woodcut of someone using dowsing to find valuables. It was very common for dowsers of this era to claim the ability to find buried valuables of all types. The next slide provides some examples of these practices. Here's an example from the 1840s. Mr. K was persuaded to believe that 2 little girls in New York could see, by looking into tumblers of water, any hidden treasure or stolen property. By their direction, therefore, he spent all the money he could obtain to find hidden and lost property, with the strongest confidence that he should obtain immense treasures by these actions. Compare this with the use of clairvoyance and divination at Oak Island. The Fanny Young Pit, dug in 1845, was named for a local clairvoyant whose guidance was used to determine the location of the pit. In the 1893 Money Pit Prospectus, it is said that the man with me had a mineral rod, or dowsing rod, and it worked all right at the money pits. The rod drew toward it from all points, right to one spot. It should also be noted that Dan Blankenship and Triton Alliance used dowsing to locate borehole 10X. So this is a very common practice and not unique to Oak Island. Last, let's review the geologic aspects of the island once more. As noted earlier, it's a glacial drumlin with multiple strata of different composition. While the upper layer is indeed hard clay that's relatively impermeable to water, the lower layers below 100 to 110 feet are sandy and filled with glacial boulders. These layers, like the anhydrite bedrock that underlies much of the area, are extremely sensitive to water and will break down under its influence. It is also now well known that the area immediately under the pit is right on the edge of the Windsor Formation, a geologic feature that underlies much of the local landmass. Robert Dunfield's map of the area shows the exact strike of the formation. Geological information about the Windsor suggests the rock layers are fragile and generally very weak. They also contain significant amounts of gravel, which is very likely the explanation for the sound said to have been heard when the John Brown Company was drilling into the pit in 1867. This was said to sound like drilling through metal in pieces, and was almost certainly gravel rather than gold coins. Here we see a copy of Dunfield's map. It shows not only the location of the money pit, directly atop the line of the Windsor Formation and near the right-hand side of the map, but also numerous other areas where subsidence has occurred along the same line. In fact, in 1878 a huge sinkhole formed between the money pit location and Smith's Cove. This was immediately declared to be a result of the alleged flood tunnels, and became known as the cave-in pit, but we now know it was simply normal geologic activity along the line of the Windsor. Given the circumstances we actually know about the area, and about the value that anhydrite limestone represented both as a building material and potentially also as a product to be spread on cultivated land, the strongest suspicion is that at some time local men found an existing sinkhole and used it as the basis for excavating the underlying limestone. There have also been reports, albeit unverified, that abandoned lime kilns have been found on the western side of the island. These, along with old roads often cited in early versions of the Money Pit legend, lead to the possible use of the island as a mining operation. At some point at a later date, unscrupulous individuals made use of the remains of the shaft to mislead local wealthy investors into excavating for buried treasure. This conclusion is supported by an understanding that other mines have been found in the area, and that the limestone was valuable at the time for a number of purposes. Its primary use at that point would have been as a component of cement. We should also, finally, be suspicious of the Money Pit tale due to its historical context. Two of the allegedly known events occurred in 1849 and 1861, respectively. These dates coincide exactly with the California gold strike at Sutter's Mill and a huge gold strike in Nova Scotia. In fact, a front-page article about Oak Island in the 1861 Nova Scotian newspaper is placed right next to another major article on events at a local gold mining field. Consider that both gold mining and treasure hunting represented the opportunity for sudden massive wealth for those who were persistent and lucky. Oak Island is, in all likelihood, a simple treasure hunting scam that grew in the telling until it's become practically an international phenomenon. It's not surprising that local groups are attempting to promote and continue the tale, since the area is relatively poor and is drastically in need of the tourism dollars supplied by the Money Pit.